Like the rest of the world, Australia must now adapt to a changing climate. As one of the driest continents on Earth, it's particularly dependent on water.
Australia is very sensitive to climate patterns and climate variability, and therefore climate change. Our climate is harsh and extreme. It's the driest inhabited continent on the planet, and so any subtle changes in climate, we see those very quickly, and we're impacted by those in profound ways.
In a warmer climate, any water that you have on the ground is going to evaporate faster. You're also going to have, on average, maybe more precipitation, but that's going to depend on where you are. If you're in the wrong place, things are going to move around. You may find that you're actually getting less rain, whereas if you're in the farther north of Australia, we expect there's going to be a lot more rain there.
It hit nearly 47 degrees in Melbourne last summer. How many days in a row of 47 degrees would it take to break Sydney? How many days in a row would it take before the infrastructure fell apart or the health system collapsed? We don't know the answer to those sorts of questions, and therefore at this stage there is an immensely rich vein of research to undertake to be able to answer that question.
The key part of the climate system that we know is changing, and that we know with virtual certainty will change in the future, is these storm tracks across the Southern Ocean. All of the models used in the IPCC, so every single of the 21 model simulations looked at by the IPCC, show this storm track in the Southern Hemisphere continuing to shift south over the next century. So that's one that we're highly confident in. We've seen the change already over the last 50 years. It's been significant and detectable, and the projection for the future is that this will continue. Whilst we have greenhouse gases increasing, that trend should continue, and that means more of these storm systems and cold fronts and moisture-bearing systems that usually hit Australia, fewer and fewer will hit Australia. More of them will remain to the south of the continent and dump their rainfall over the ocean, where clearly no farmer can benefit from that. I should say though, to the north of Australia, it's a completely different system. Over northern Australia, it's the monsoon rains for the tropics, and that part of Australia has received, if anything, increased rainfall, particularly over the northwest part of Australia. So we've got the south, by and large, on a drying trend, the north, by and large, increasing in rainfall, and those patterns of change are completely consistent with what we expect under greenhouse-induced climate change.
When you put CO2 into the ocean, it forms an acid, a weak acid, and that acid goes on to change the calcium carbonate cycle, which is all the bugs which have shells. The ecosystem is like a pyramid, and at the base of that pyramid you have all these, the plankton is the phytoplankton and the zooplankton are at the base of the pyramid. All those little bugs that you can't really see in the ocean, which make up most of the biomass of the ocean. So as we lower the pH, because we're putting CO2 into the ocean, lowering the pH, we're going to start to see dissolving of those particular shells in that part of the marine ecosystem. So there's a lot of research going in now to really understanding what the impacts are, what species are most vulnerable, and also how that relates to the entire marine ecosystem.
The big dry over southeastern Australia that's lasted for about 15 years, an unprecedented dry spell for that part of Australia through the observational records. That's been characterised by an absence of what we call the negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole, and that's just a pattern of temperature in the Indian Ocean that usually brings us good rains over the southeast. If you go back through the last 150 years, that negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole occurs quite regularly, every 3 to 7 years. The fact we have 15 years without a single negative phase of the Indian Ocean dipole has meant southeastern Australia hasn't had a year of really good healthy rains, and that's led to this drought we have. Typically Australia does have dry years and wet years, and that's part of our natural cycle, but if we suddenly have no wet years for about 15 years, that affects the local vegetation coverage. It really dries out the forests down there, and it means that it means hot events, heat wave events like the bushfires in Victoria only the end of last summer, the preceding summer, can be very, very severe because all the vegetation's been dried out from 10 years of sustained below average rainfall.
There's certainly a case that people always hear the bad news stories associated with global warming. There's a good reason for that. We have tuned our agricultural systems, our water storage systems, our economy to a climate over the last several hundred years. So we are used to a particular climate, and we've adapted our whole economy to be as efficient as we can for that climate. If you then change that climate, you move it outside of the area that we have tuned our society to, or our agricultural systems to. That tends to be a negative because we're not as skillfully adapted to the new climate as we were to the old. So that's a problem.
Most climate models, and they have their shortcomings, and we don't necessarily believe everything they say, but they predict that Australia will be a loser when it comes to rainfall in a warmer world. Other places will be winners. It's just a question of what latitude you live at. And if you look at the data right now for water vapor trends, it's not clear yet whether those predictions are going to turn out to be true, but I'd be betting on them if I were a betting man.
The science on global warming in terms of the consequences of continuing to emit CO2 at the current rates of 8 billion tons of CO2 a year has been done. It's not going to get suddenly more certain because it's already certain. So if communities are waiting out there, or politicians are waiting out there for a higher level of scientific certainty, they're misunderstanding the science, which isn't. There's no wriggle room in the basic science anymore, despite what people may have heard in the media. There is a huge challenge in the science of regionalising the climate change projections. So rather than saying Australia will warm by 3 degrees by 2100, on the average, first of all saying yes, but the tropics might only warm by 1 degree, which means that Victoria might warm by more, and really detailed projections of the changes in temperatures and extremes, and the rainfall extremes, wind, hail, drought, lots of challenges in there. But my very strong view is none of that is actually going to change people's views. There are a group of people who know the science is right because they work within that area and have communicated that to a significant number of people who get it, or they trust the climate scientists. There's a vocal minority of people who are actively undermining the science for reasons that kind of escape me because, as far as I know, they don't have another planet to go to if we don't solve this problem. And there's a group of people in the middle, and the politicians are one, the policymakers globally, who haven't understood the scale of the problem and haven't understood that this is a little bit like a juggernaut going down the freeway 110. I think politicians sometimes think in terms of global warming that if they needed to, they could stop that juggernaut instantaneously. They could just stop it and everything would be fine. But the climate system takes 20 or 30 years to respond to a change in the emissions. So if we stopped emissions today, we're committed to the climate changes that are in the system through to about 2040. So the cuts in emissions aren't about the climate as it will evolve between now and 2040. They're about what the climate will look like from 2040 to 2070. And so we now need to make the cuts in the emissions for quite a long time into the future. We're already stuffed in terms of what is going to happen between now and 2040. And I don't think we've communicated that to politicians.
Max Planck, a German physicist, famously said, you can't bring a new idea to the population in general and expect it to be accepted uniformly. You may sometimes have to wait for a new generation to grow up understanding that idea before it is widely accepted. And unfortunately with climate change, we don't have a whole generation to wait. We could wait for a whole generation when Galileo said the Earth rotated around the sun. We could wait for a whole generation or 2 or 3 for Darwin's evolution theories to be widely accepted. With climate change, the science has been around for 3 or 4 generations. It's only really been visible in the public, out of the journals and into the public debate for the last few years. And so if we have to wait 30 or 40 years for this to be widely accepted, that's going to be way too late in terms of avoiding dangerous climate change.
Somebody asked me what my personal strategy was for my kids, and my answer was a good education and 2 passports, because then at least they can move if Australia is hit particularly hard. I have no evidence that it will be hit particularly hard climatologically. I think it will be hit, but not necessarily particularly hard. But I have no idea where 300 million Bangladeshis go if sea level takes out that delta. I have no idea where the populations of India and China, dependent on the freshwater flows from the Himalayan glaciers, will go if that starts to become vulnerable. I have no idea where those peoples go if the monsoon systems fail. But I'm pretty sure they will look to the richest countries they can get at, and Australia is one. So my message is twofold. First of all, if you're nervous about large numbers of environmental refugees, and I think that will be a challenge for Australia, start beating on your politicians to act nationally and internationally on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And the second one is, Australia's economy is at the moment built on the export of coal and iron ore. So we sell iron ore and the coal to China and India to smelt the iron ore and to make the power to make goods that we bring back to Australia. That's an intensive carbonly expensive exchange. We need to have Australia's economy independent of those vulnerable exports. We need to, over the next 10 or 20 years, rebuild the Australian economy. So if somebody said, we are now stopping coal exports and iron ore exports, nobody would notice. Now that's a tremendous challenge, to rebuild the Australian economy with smart, innovative technologies that you can export for values equivalent to iron and steel and coal. But anyone who actually believes that there will be huge ships carrying coal from Queensland to China in 50 years' time completely misunderstands the nature of the climate change. That will not be happening. We will not be exporting in the future because it won't be part of the global economy. And we have to rebuild the Australian economy to be immune to those changes very urgently. And my view is we're 20 years behind.